Is it crunch time for China? As Russia attacks Ukraine, Moscow asks Beijing for help. Will Xi Jinping be Putin's lifeline, or could China leave Russia even more isolated? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is China's role in the crisis in Ukraine. Many believe the key to pressuring President Vladimir Putin to stop Russia's assault on Ukraine lies with Beijing. So far, the Chinese government has tried to walk a diplomatic tightrope. But if it's forced to take sides, how much would it risk to help Russia? That question has come sharply into focus in the past 24 hours, with reports in U.S. media that Moscow has indeed requested both economic and military assistance from Beijing. The U.S. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan warned China would face consequences if it helps Russia out. Sullivan met his Chinese counterpart in Rome, where peace talks were held on Monday. China says Moscow has not asked for help, but Beijing still refuses to condemn Russia's military action. We'll discuss how China could swing the conflict in either direction, but first, let's take a look at where things stand. Well, Russia continued shelling major Ukrainian cities on Monday, including the capital, Kiev. Over the weekend, it pounded a military base near the Polish border with cruise missiles, killing at least 35 people and injuring around 150 others. The International Peacekeeping and Security Center was a hub for NATO-Ukrainian cooperation. In Irpin, just north of the capital, an American reporter was shot and killed on Sunday. Brent Renaud became the first foreign journalist to die covering the conflict. Almost 3 weeks after the assault started, this is how the map looks. Russia has advanced far into the east of the country, where the separatist-run Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic are. It currently occupies the Black Sea port of Kherson. That lies close to Crimea, which Russia annexed in 2014. The besieged southern city of Mariupol has been without power and vital supplies for more than a week. Its city council says more than 2,000 residents have been killed. And in the north, Russia has been making steady and significant advances toward Kiev. Well, despite the worsening situation on the ground, there was optimism on Monday that another round of talks between representatives of Ukraine and Russia could bring some breakthrough. But Ukraine's chief negotiator says their position hasn't changed and that their priority is agreeing on a ceasefire, troop withdrawals, and security guarantees.
Our proposals are on the table. They are quite tough. It includes withdrawal of forces, a ceasefire. We will not give up any of our positions. Russia already understands it and starts talking constructively. I think we will reach concrete results in a matter of days.
According to my personal expectations, this progress may grow in the coming days into a joint position of both delegations into documents for signing.
Now, in the lead-up to the launch of Russia's incursion in February, Russia and China had been growing much closer. In December, President Putin and his Chinese counterpart pledged to defend each other's security interests. But it's a relationship that's seen its share of ups and downs. China had the closest of ties with the Soviet Union in the 1950s, but they fell apart dramatically a decade later over their contrasting interpretations of communism. Hostilities continued through the 1970s before eventually coming full circle again in the 1990s. The relationship seemed closer than ever last year when Xi condemned Western nations for interfering in the internal affairs of both China and Russia under the guise of democracy and human rights. But China was one of 35 nations that abstained from voting to condemn Russia's attack at the UN General Assembly. And Beijing has delivered the first 2 of several batches of humanitarian aid to Ukraine.
Recently, the U.S. has been constantly spreading disinformation against China. This is malicious. China's position on Ukraine is consistent and clear. We've always been playing a constructive role in promoting peace talks. The top priority now is that all parties should exercise restraint to de-escalate and cool down the situation.
So where does China really stand on Russia's actions, and could its influence in Moscow prove a game changer in the conflict? Joining me now from Beijing is Victor Gao. He's a chair professor at Suzhou University. Andrei Kortunov is in Moscow. He is the Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council. And in Birmingham, UK, Scott Lucas is the founder of EA Worldview and Professor Emeritus at the University of Birmingham. Thanks all so much for being with us. Let's begin then with the latest, and the U.S. National Security Advisor trying to convince China not to provide more weapons to Moscow to fight Ukraine. Victor Gao, the United States is, of course, the biggest consumer of Chinese goods, but China sees Russia now as a key strategic partner. So what is in China's interest here?
China and Russia have very strong and deeply rooted strategic relations. They are not allies, but their relations are stronger and better than allies. Now, as far as the military operations in Ukraine is concerned, China is asking all the parties concerned to de-escalate and to wind down the war to an end with minimum civilian losses. China chooses peace in this process. Now, you mentioned China is not only the largest trading partner for the United States in many ways, China is also the largest lender to the United States. China is the largest manufacturing country and the trading nation in the world. China wants to play the role of a mediator if the parties involved require such services, and this is only for peace and negotiation. We urge the parties to engage with each other in negotiation to save civilian lives and to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible.
So will China provide military assistance to Russia or not?
Russia has the strongest military force in the world. No one should underestimate that or belittle that fact. The fact that Russia has not used the most sophisticated weapons as far as the military operations in Ukraine is concerned doesn't mean that Russia does not have the most sophisticated military weapons. I'll be surprised if Russia would need any military assistance from China, and China's role is mediation, calling for parties to engage with each other in diplomacy. Okay. China is also against other countries pouring more fuel onto the fire, because that's not helpful, that's not constructive, that's really risking more civilian lives in Ukraine. We all need to join in urging the parties to engage with each other in diplomacy and negotiation to seek a mutually acceptable solution.
Scott Lucas, let me get your perspective on something. I mean, some are saying China wants to have its cake and eat it too. Beijing denounced sanctions on Moscow and actually blames Washington for this conflict. But it doesn't want to sacrifice its relationship with Ukraine, so it's sending, humanitarian aid there. I'd like to actually listen quickly to what China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi said just last week about Beijing's relationship with Russia.
The friendship between the two peoples is ironclad. The prospect for cooperation are extensive. No matter how perilous the international landscape, China and Russia will maintain our strategic focus and promote the development of a comprehensive partnership in the new era.
So, Scott, can China have it both ways in its relationships with the U.S. and Ukraine and Russia as well?
No. And that's why China is keeping its head down. As I think we've heard from Professor Gao's excellent summary, China would like to have this strategic relationship with Russia, but it has been jeopardized by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine and by the response of much of the international community against the invasion in support of Kiev. So notice Professor Gao's emphasis, which reflects the official line on two words, de-escalation and mediation. I think that quite clearly is signaling that China, at least openly, is not going to provide the military assistance that Russia might need as its offensive struggles. And I think, in fact, China might be reticent to provide economic assistance while the Russian economy faces what might be a crisis amid sanctions. That said, what the United States clearly did over the weekend, both through official statements like that of the National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and through stories priming the media, is to say to the Chinese, we're watching you. We're watching to see if you do provide this assistance to the Russians. And if you do provide this assistance to the Russians, effectively taking sides in this conflict and putting your head up, as it were, there could be consequences.
Right. So the consequences might be there, but we are still hearing concerns that, China might be able to actually nullify the effects of Western sanctions on Russia simply by becoming its biggest trade partner. Would that be possible?
No, this line was out from analysts as well as from supporters of Putin's invasion before it even occurred, and I was always skeptical of it. Because, first of all, the Chinese economy, which is linked to the international system, but it's not, as it were, in some ways part of the international system. China has a currency which is not an internationally recognized currency. China pursues trade relationships which, while they are linked to the West and international community, they cannot do that bilaterally with the Russians in the same way that they work through other currencies, such as the dollar, such as the euro. So, most importantly, does China really want to be the lifeline, almost the life support for a Russian economy which is failing? Because that means China is not actually economically profiting or progressing from bailing out the Russians, but China is actually pulling its economy down with the Russians, especially if this proves to be a protracted war or indeed a protracted Ukrainian insurgency backed by the international community.
Okay. Andrei Kortunov, we heard actually the counter-argument from Professor Gao on this question, but what do you think the fact that Russia is asking China for military assistance says about Russia's position and the power of its military in this conflict?
Well, we don't know exactly what the Kremlin is asking China for. I frankly don't think that Russia has a shortage of the military hardware that it can utilize in Ukraine. Definitely, there is a margin of safety. Definitely, the Kremlin has been preparing for this situation for a long time. So I don't think that there is a clear deficit of ammunition or equipment or the manpower. If this conflict turns out to be a protracted one, that might change the calculus in Moscow, and then Russia might need more active Chinese assistance. It might ask for such assistance. But right now, I think Russia counts on the Chinese political support. And as we know, China abstained in the UN Security Council when they discussed a resolution criticizing Russia for its behavior. China also voices its criticism of the NATO alliance. And I think that this is what Russia counts on. Definitely, this conflict will have long-term implications for the Russian trade priorities. For instance, one can imagine that China will strengthen its positions as the main consumer of Russia's hydrocarbons. Oil and gas, which is now sold to Europe, might be redirected to Asia and mostly to China. But this is something that will not happen tomorrow. It will take a couple of years for Europe to emancipate itself from the dependency on Russian energy. And it will also take a couple of years for China to have new pipelines and new sources of Russia's energy to be exploited in the Chinese economy. I don't think that China is in a position to replace the West in many areas. But for instance, I think that with the many Western car manufacturers leaving the country, China might feel the slot left by them, and many other consumer good items are likely to shift to Russia, and China is likely to become even more important as the provider of these consumer items like smartphones or cars or computers. Definitely, the Chinese presence in the Russian market will increase.
Okay. Andrei, quickly though, I just want to clarify if these reports that we're hearing from U.S. media that that Russia has asked for China's military assistance here. Do you think those reports are just false?
I have no information to confirm these reports. Frankly, I see no way China can support Russia in practical terms because China is far away. It's not a factor in the European strategic balance. So I'm not sure that China can render any practical assistance to the Kremlin.
Okay. Victor Gal, let me come back to you because there is this suspicion that perhaps behind the scenes, Russia and China are forming a stronger alliance that could be mutually beneficial because out of China's supporting Russian actions in Ukraine, China could get Russian backing for what many say it plans to do on similar lines in Taiwan. Do you think there's any truth to that?
A couple of points. First of all, China-Russian relations are very, very good, mutually beneficial. China and Russia share a common border of 4,700 kilometers, which has been very peaceful, tranquil, mutually beneficial for decades. And allow me to make one point. No political force in the world can force or coerce China into discontinuing its very mutually beneficial normal relations with Russia. And China and Russia, either separately or combined together, will not yield to any bullying by any power in the world. Now, the Ukrainian situation and the Taiwan situation are completely different. Taiwan is part of China. Even the United States acknowledges there is only one China, and Taiwan is part of China, and the People's Republic of China is the sole legitimate representative of China. This is the megatrend in the world. Chinese reunification will happen sooner or later, and by peaceful means, as we prefer, or by non-peaceful means, if it has to. Now, when that happens, the United States, in my true belief, will not want to shed the blood of the American soldiers for the defense of Taiwan. Why? Because it is not in the American people's interest to shed American blood for the defense of Taiwan, which is, for example, the recontinuation of the unfinished civil war in China. This is the megatrend. Don't confuse the Taiwan situation with Ukraine, and these two need to be looked at very carefully. And in this sense, I think China and Russia are both opposed to the continued expansion of NATO. Why? Because this expansion of NATO into Ukraine, for example, does provoke Russia into actions that are unfolding as we speak in Ukraine.
Scott Lucas, I really want to get what you make of that analysis right there. And, you know, if the West ups its pressure on China to stay away from Taiwan, could that push China closer in its alliance with Russia if there is mutual recognition of the actions that they're taking, Russia and Ukraine, China potentially soon in Taiwan?
Well, we need to be very clear here. I mean, China's not the victim here. Russia's not the victim here. Russia was not the victim of NATO expansion into Ukraine. NATO was not expanding into Ukraine. That was the pretext for a war which Vladimir Putin has chosen to have. I think what's troubling for Professor Gao, especially if it reflects official Chinese thinking, is the idea that in some respects, it can pursue the military option over Taiwan, what he calls the non-diplomatic option. I think the reality has been very different here, and this is what might be troubling Beijing. Vladimir Putin was gambling that he would not get pushback from the United States, from Europe, from NATO over this invasion. He was gambling, in fact, had been for months, that he could break, in fact, the alliance in support of Kiev. And although there have been limits in that support, notably provision of jet fighters to Kiev, by and large, we've seen more economic, political, and military support than many expected. Now, I think for China, if it was seriously considering the military option over Taiwan, rather than a peaceful pursuit of what is called reunification, that's got to be a sign that trying to rattle a saber over Taiwan and saying this must be reunified by force if necessary is not necessarily going to be one where it gets its way and backs the United States away. In other words, I think something's interesting that's happened in the last few months. The disastrous U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan may have led to some miscalculations on the part of Moscow, and indeed on Beijing, that you had a weakened U.S. and a weakened international community. Now, that's not been the case over Ukraine, and I would hate to see China testing it over Taiwan.
Okay, Victor, if you'd like to respond quickly, go ahead.
I think this is completely irresponsible. Why? Because even the government of the United Kingdom acknowledges there is only one China and Taiwan is part of China. Now, China does not want to achieve national reunification as of yesterday or today. China had an unfinished civil war which forced the nationalist government to flee China's mainland to Taiwan in 1949. So any country which wants to provoke more tension across the two sides of the Taiwan Strait will really cause the re-insurrection of the unfinished civil war. When the unfinished civil war is restarted, you can bet with China, or you can bet with the Chinese mainland, or with Taiwan. But let me assure you, no country should underestimate the Chinese nation's determination to achieve national reunification. This is the mega trend of our times, and this will be achieved by peaceful means, as we prefer, or non-peaceful means if it has to be. I don't think the British want to shed the British soldiers' blood for the defense of Taiwan. Against what? Not an invasion, but of national reunification of the Chinese people.
Okay. I'd like to speak to Andrei now about something similar then from the Russian perspective, because, you know, President Putin has said that the breakup of the Soviet Union was actually the greatest catastrophe, political catastrophe, of the 20th century. He's also said that he has a responsibility to bring all Russian speakers really back to the mother country. I mean, it sounds somewhat similar to what Professor Gao was saying about China's ultimate ambitions in reuniting under the One China policy. So now the worry is that Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine, and people are even mentioning World War III. So they're drawing parallels with World War II, and that the West has been allowed to appease Putin in its actions in Georgia and Ukraine and Crimea, for example. I'm wondering where you stand. Would you go that far as to say that there is potential here for outright global conflict because of what is happening between Russia and Ukraine now?
Well, I would like to say that there is no risk, but I cannot. I think there is a risk, and a lot will depend on the reaction by NATO. If in the Kremlin they conclude that NATO is ready to intervene directly into this conflict by installing a no-fly zone, for example, or doing something else, then Moscow might opt to escalate. And definitely, we do not know where this escalation will lead to. That might go even to the level of a nuclear war after a couple of cycles of escalation. However, I think that NATO has demonstrated certain prudence in responding to the conflict. I don't think that NATO will intervene. I don't think that NATO will try to install a no-fly zone. It might assist Ukraine more than it does, but this assistance is not likely to change the balance of powers on the battlefield. So if NATO is not going to intervene, the chances of escalation remain low. If it does, the chances are likely to grow.
Okay, Scott Lucas, we're down to our last few minutes, so I'd like to give you some time for final words, final analysis of what you've heard on this panel.
Well, so many issues and to be considered. Mr. Kortunov, I think, is very, very shrewd in his assessment. NATO is not going to intervene with forces directly in Ukraine, in the air or on the ground, because they know, one, that Vladimir Putin could then play the victim, and two, it risks a wider confrontation. What we are seeing is that a red line is being drawn and has been restated over the weekend against any Russian attack on NATO countries. And that will include Poland, which is pertinent because of the expansion of the Russian aerial campaign in Western Ukraine. I would say the one area to watch, and I'd love to discuss this with Mr. Kortunov later, is Moldova, which is not a NATO member, but which it has been under pressure from Russia because of this. So I think, in effect, we have a global conflict in the sense that everyone has an interest in what happens in Ukraine, but right now it is still within Ukraine, if it makes sense. Secondly, another aspect of the global conflict, let's be very clear here. Being provocative and being irresponsible is the statement which we've heard from our Chinese friend about a non-peaceful approach to Taiwan. If China pursues a peaceful approach to Taiwan, as it did with Hong Kong, then perhaps it can achieve reunification. But there is nothing to be achieved here from Beijing trying to rattle sabers to say it is our historical destiny to have Taiwan, and we will use non-peaceful means to do it. I hope that the Beijing government is a little bit more measured than our Chinese friend, Professor Gao, in assessing this, and does consider to pursue diplomacy and backs off any threat of a military expansion of conflict at a time when we're trying to deal with Ukraine.
Okay, Victor Gao, please, 30 seconds left. I'll take your response.
I think mankind has never been as close to the brink of nuclear catastrophe as we are now. So let's de-escalate through negotiations to bring the war in Ukraine to an end with minimum civilian losses. The peaceful reunification of the two sides of the Taiwan Strait is what we prefer. But other countries should not stand in the way to prevent that from happening. And other countries should no longer continue to send weapons to Taiwan, because that will provoke the resurrection of the civil war, and the national reunification of China will take place sooner or later. This is not a threat. It is the ultimate megatrend of our times.
You believe it's a
fact. Be
fact.
prepared for that.
Okay, Victor Gao, Andrei Kortunov, Scott Lucas, thank you all so much for being with us on this edition of Newsmakers, and to our viewers as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers. We always appreciate your comments, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.